I want you to please give a very warm welcome to our dear friend Terry Botwick.
Thank you, guys. If you don't mind, I have some notes on my phone that I'm going to refer to as we go through. But first, I got to say thank you to Paul. He's been a great host, and Hollywood. There's a sort of a different language in Hollywood, and when he says that the February 19th date was open, and that this discussion with Otis Hildman led to me, what I hear in Hollywood speak is, "You're the last guy on the list. We couldn't afford anybody else." So I'm glad to be with you guys this morning. It's early by LA standards, so if you don't nod off, I will. But I want to talk to you about a couple things that really, after 30 years of being in the entertainment business, are kind of the driving principles of my life now. And I'll talk a little bit about my own background as we go. But I want to make two main points, or talk under two main themes. The first is engaging the culture, and then the second one is how do we make it a business? Because everybody hears stories about people coming and wanting to raise money for a movie, and somebody gives them the money and they lose the money, and Hollywood gets this black eye, and it really doesn't have to be that way, and it shouldn't be that way. And engaging the culture and being involved in entertainment is not only an imperative for us, but it should be profitable for us. It should be profitable in terms of how we make deposits into the global culture, and it should be profitable financially if we do it right. So I mentioned to some guys last night that a lot of people don't realize that film and entertainment is the United States' second largest export. And so no matter what we do, we are influencing the global culture. And I think it's important for us as believers to have a seat at that table. One of the things that's happened, I think, unfortunately, and I'll talk a little bit about some of these, how we get there, but in the U.S. market, there's been this bifurcation where there's kind of like the quote-unquote Christian film, and then there's everything else. And it's actually become like a genre in Hollywood, like the Christian film genre, which I think is terribly, terribly unfortunate. Because stories of faith, stories that carry biblical truth should be across all genres. And so far what we've seen are movies, some of them are good and worthwhile and very beneficial, but they appeal to the church, they never get outside the church, and we're not impacting the world or challenging the world at all. So what do I mean by engaging the culture? For me, story is the most powerful vehicle that we can use. Scientists will actually say that the number one way that you change somebody's mind is through story. I was talking to another Terry earlier about advertising. Advertisers have known this forever. You have to tell a story. Sometimes you're telling it in 30 seconds or 15 seconds or 2 hours, but it's the telling of the story that convinces somebody and changes their mind. So for me, engaging the culture is about primarily two things. It is communicating something, not everything in one sitting, but something about the nature of God and the things that he cares about. So I say, and you have to do that in a commercial way. It's very challenging. So I say, why didn't a Christian make Hotel Rwanda? Why didn't a Christian, if you care about sex traffic, make a commercial movie like Taken and put a big spotlight on it? And why didn't the church use that as a catalyst to talk about how we bring change in the culture once we've spent tens of millions of dollars to bring everybody's attention to this issue? So how do we, through story, communicate something about the nature of God, challenge people, and make lasting change? I mentioned also last night at dinner that something that's I can't prove to anybody, but I think it's true. And we had everybody here in this room has a unique story. We heard some of Joe's story a minute ago, and God is at work in every one of us, and God has wired each of us in a certain way to do unique things that only you can do in the world. And I personally believe that when we read the narrative parts of the Bible, that those are excerpts from what the Bible calls the book of life. And I think the book of life is actually all of our stories that we get to enjoy for the rest of eternity. And there's something unique, there's something incredibly powerful about people together sharing story, and it's been done for thousands and thousands of years. It's a place where we share in struggles to understand, who is God, how do we relate to God, let me go back and talk a little bit about myself. So I'm a Jewish kid from New Jersey, just over the George Washington Bridge in Fairlawn, and my dad's family's from Russia. My mother's family is from Poland. Both of them were first generation in the U.S., and they had a incredibly dysfunctional marriage and family, but nothing that was so overt and obvious. But growing up, it as a young boy, it definitely had an impact on me. Although I couldn't articulate it. It wasn't something that was very obvious, but it was stuff that I felt, and it led to all this pent up anger. And by the time I was a teenager, I was a really pretty angry young man. And I wound up in California because it's as far as I could go before I bumped into the ocean. And there, in 1975, I came to know Jesus. So I didn't grow up in church culture. I don't really care, forgive me, about church culture. I don't really care about the doctrinal differences that divide us all the time, some of which I think are ill-conceived. What I care about is knowing God, what's the truth, and how do I communicate that. In fact, the Bible itself is... we're so busy trying to get people to conform to the Bible, but the Bible itself is really a communication from people who had an experience with God, and then they communicate it, and then we learn from it, and we measure our own experience in some way against that, and hopefully Scripture points us to God where we have our own experience as well. So I married a Irish Catholic, half Puerto Rican girl. Her mother is Rosemary Clooney. Her father was a very successful actor, Jose Ferrer, and because she's half Puerto Rican, I keep sharp objects away from her. But when I was a boy, I always had this sense of God being there. It was, I don't know if it was the lessons I learned in Hebrew school that I went to for 7 years, but there was always a tangible sense of God's presence there. And but as I said earlier, I was kind of angry and rebellious. But I've come to, as I've wrestled through 30 years of my career, in trying to integrate my faith and try to figure out how do you do that in a way that could make a difference in people's lives, I've sort of boiled down. And like my father's going to be 94 years old next month, and so it's great to be here with all of you and get a chance to also spend some time with him. But it's astounding to me. He's a pretty smart guy, he's lived a long life, and if you ask him about God, he doesn't think God exists. He thinks God is some kind of a moral code, which to me is crazy. Because if there's no God, and we're left to survival of the fittest, then I'm going to take what you have and hope that nobody else takes what I have, because that's kind of what you're left with. And most people who don't believe in God feel that way because they look around the world and they say, well, how can a good God be in existence if there's all this suffering? And I think that you have to boil the whole discussion down into very simple questions. The first one is, do you believe in God or not? This subatomic particles that somehow formed itself into this stand here, did they somehow come out of absolutely nothing? Zero. No other subatomic particles, no atoms, no anything. Did they just appear from nothing, given enough time and chance? Because if you don't believe in God, that's what you're left with. Or is there a God? And if God created, then you're left with a couple of choices again. Did he spin all this into motion and walk away like the deists might believe? Or is he personal? And if he's personal, what does that mean for my life? How do I have to respond to that? What does he require of me? I last night at dinner mentioned this, so sorry for the guys who are hearing it a second time, but I love this moment in Abraham's life. he lives in this brutal polytheistic culture, and somehow the one true God of the universe makes himself known to Abraham in a way that he understands that this is different, and develops a relationship with him. And along the way, God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and he stops off to visit his friend Abraham and to tell him what he's going to do. And Abraham begins to negotiate with God. God, I mean, far be it from you if there's 50 righteous, if there's 40, if there's 30. And, which, being Jewish, I recognize that that's what Middle Eastern guys do, is they negotiate all the time about everything. But underneath that is the single most important question that, as I said a moment ago, people ask. How can there be all this suffering? God, who are you? That's what Abraham's asking. Underneath that is, if there's one righteous person, you would destroy the whole place? What is your justice like? Who are you? What is your nature like? And it's those questions at the core of who we are that we all wrestle with, that story powerfully attacks in people and causes them to confront. I want to say a few things about the American evangelical church, again, being, I came to the Lord in 1975 in a non-denominational church. It was if you guys have heard of this denomination, the Vineyard, there's now 1,100 churches in different parts of the country and the world, and this was the first Vineyard in 1975. It started as a Bible study, and by the time I got there, it had just become like 50 people in the Beverly Hills Women's Club. And so I've been in a lot of church settings. I've been in non-denominational settings. We lived here in Darien for a couple of years when I worked at Hearst, and we went to St. Paul's, where at one point in time there was a great move of God, and it was a fantastic church, when we were here. But I think there's some mistakes that get made in the American evangelistic or world that impact the way we relate to film, entertainment, television, media, that part of what I think is my calling is to speak into and to correct. The first mistake, number one, is the evangelical church thinks that films are evangelism, because they think that all of life is some sort of a response to how they read the Great Commission. And they think that it's all about, get out of your lazy boy, go talk to Vinny over here, get him to say a few words, get him to raise his hand in the service, notch your belt, go home, you've done a good job. But it's actually a misinterpretation of the Great Commission. Jesus never said that. What Jesus actually said was, in your going, whatever you're doing every day, make disciples. And so that's mistake number one, is evangelism is a very personal, interactive experience. Film is a terrible vehicle for evangelism. We should never use it that way. God can use anything, but it should not be our intent. Second thing is that the American church, I think sometimes we're Americans first and we're Christians second. So if you're an American, guns are good. You can slaughter all the people you want on screen. But if you see a nipple, you're going to hell. And if you go to France, you can see all the nipples you want, but if you pick up a gun, you're going to hell. So it's a very cultural experience. And so a lot of the evangelical church confuses wholesome and biblical. And they think, you always hear those words faith and family together. Family is really important. But stories of faith are not necessarily appropriate for a 5-year-old. Not all stories of faith. And the Bible is not a wholesome book. I mean, everybody in the room can quote stories from the Bible that if you were to be there in person, or if you were to depict them in any kind of an authentic way, would be, you'd be hard-pressed to not have an R rating in that movie. And so we have to be honest with Scripture, and sometimes it's uncomfortable to be challenged by God with what, God telling his prophet Hosea, marry a prostitute. David and Bathsheba, of course. Judas sleeping with his daughter-in-law who is posing as a prostitute, and through that experience comes the Messiah. It's very messy. The Jacob and Esau story. I mean, God promises to deliver through the seed of Jacob, and yet the whole process happens through complete and total deception, and God uses that. And so it's not always comfortable. It's not always squeaky clean. And it's not necessarily in film the absence of what some people might think is objectionable material that makes for a compelling story. It's actually proactively what we put into the stories that challenge and engage us that's more important. We have to do it with good taste. We shouldn't be gratuitous in the way we depict things, but we should never shy away from the truth of the story, and it's the truth that will resonate with people. So real quickly, there's, of these films that we call Christian films now, if you look at Barna research, Barna would say that they are drawing mostly from a pool of about 13 million evangelicals. So there's a couple 100 million people in the United States, if you include the Catholic Church, who consider themselves to be Christians and look to Jesus as their Savior. There's about 40 million evangelicals. 22 million of those people, research would say that their behavior is influenced by their faith. So there's 13 million people that is the pool that we're drawing from for these quote-unquote Christian films. And I can tell you from my experience with Captive and the research I've done through the years that absolutely the vast majority of those people, I can't give you an exact number, but the vast majority of those 13 million people do not like those movies as a movie-going experience. They see the ministry value in it, and they feel an obligation to support those movies, but it's not a cinematic experience for them. And then you have 9 million people on top of that, gets you to the 22 million people who also would say that their faith influences their behavior. They will never go see one of those Christian movies. They'll go see The Blind Side, they'll go see The Help, they'll go see Unbroken, they'll go see Gladiator, they'll go see all kinds of movies, but they won't go see those sermons on film. Now the difference is we have a way to communicate with those 13 million people through Christian radio, through celebrity pastors, through Christian bookstores, and so we have an efficient way to talk to them, and we do not have an efficient way to talk to those 9 million people yet. But we have to develop that and evolve that, let alone the broader church and the Catholic Church and the believers around the world. So if I went to the leaders of those, the influencers of those 13 million people, and I said to them, I have a great idea for a movie, and I want you to tell me if you'll support me in this. Now here's the idea. It's about a man who is forced into a situation he does not want to be in. And when he's there, he's committed to the fact that justice has to be served. In fact, he's so committed that everybody abandons him and he's left all alone, and a number of the people actually even attack him and try and take him down for this position that he's taken. In the end, he develops a relationship that you could only call loving your enemy. So should we make that movie? And I think the leaders would wholeheartedly say, absolutely make that movie. We'd be happy to support that. Those are clearly biblical themes. And I would say, well, the shame of it is, Steven Spielberg just made that movie. It's called Bridge of Spies, and you're not even talking about it. But I have an idea for a second movie. Tell me if you'll support me in this one. It's about a young woman who is just stunningly beautiful, and her family is in crisis. And it is so desperate that she literally is forced to prostitute herself in order to save her family. And there's really no mention of God in the entire story. Would you support me should I make that movie? And they would probably throw me out of the church. To which I would say, that's a real shame because her name is Esther and she's in the Bible. And so it's why I'm saying we're not in the evangelical community looking at truth in a way that I think is an imperative for us. Let me quickly turn the corner because I'm watching the clock to talk about making it a business, but in closing out this section of engaging the culture, I think it's an imperative for everybody in this room, whether you are a moviegoer and you talk about the themes that are in those movies with your neighbor, and that just doesn't mean finding one that supports your position, but go to the movie that doesn't support your position and use that as a springboard to talk about life and the things that challenge you and better ways to live life, but get engaged. And the second thing is, for some people in the room, get engaged for real. Roll up your sleeves. Joe made a transition from Wall Street to trying to make movies. I mean, get engaged, make a difference. Because, as I said earlier, it is our second largest export, and we will influence the world. Hollywood will influence the world one way or the other, and it's critically important that we have a seat at the table. Okay, so Hollywood gets a bad rap. Some of it's well-deserved. There are criminals in Hollywood. I know that surprises you, but part of the reason we're there, by the way, is because we get in a relationship with people and we can make a difference in their lives. But Hollywood isn't really, people in Hollywood, people at the major studios, people who are part of these public companies are not necessarily going to rip you off when you walk in the door. What they do is take advantage of their position. If they've got leverage in a business deal, they will do the absolute best they can for themselves. If you have leverage in a business deal, you do absolutely the best you can for yourself. And if you really know the business and understand it, I'm fortunate that I've been a creative executive, I've been a producer, and I've also run businesses in the entertainment industry. So it helps me to be able to look at the deal structure, to understand where somebody's going to hide money, where they're not going to hide money, how to structure around that, how to protect ourselves. But they're not. It's not like somebody saying, you have to do business with each other another day. It's become a little worse. It's become purely transactional. Honestly, it used to be a little more honor among thieves. But everybody in Hollywood knows, if we may be mortal enemies, but if I have something you think you need, you're going to do business with me, no matter what you think of me, and that's when I have leverage. So, and capital helps to bring that leverage. Now, the truth is, no matter how good a movie is, any single film has a high standard deviation of risk. It's just there's a lot of things outside your control. I was partners with a man named Ralph Winter for about 6 years, and Ralph was involved in a movie once that it was like a wartime movie, and it opened like the weekend that the first Gulf War broke out. Nobody wanted to go see that movie because it was on the news every 5 minutes. And so there's things sometimes outside your control that make a single movie risky, no matter how good it is. And so the way that studios invest in movies, which guys in the room that are in the finance business will well understand, is through portfolio theory. Every studio puts out 15 to 20 movies a year, and each of those major studios, on a cash-on-cash basis, are delivering about a 20% return on that slate year in and year out. And in addition to that, they have massive libraries that are spinning off tremendous amounts of cash that fund operations. And so that's the difference in a passionate desire to translate a story into a movie and making it a business. And so, without getting too deep into the details, what we're trying to do at 1019 now is take our creativity and a solid management team, and we're trying to capitalize the company in a way that enables us to have a film fund that will finance a portfolio of movies. A portfolio is not 3 movies or 5 movies or 7 movies, it's 20 movies over a 5-year production term, and that delivers like a 34% IRR, and that has, when you look at, if you run a Monte Carlo on the financial model, it gives you 0.5% of loss. So it's a highly investable, structured finance product that people on Wall Street understand, people in the oil business understand, people in real estate understand, and it's the right way to make movies a business so that we can do something sustainable, so that we can train up a generation of people behind us, and that we can continue to chip away at the global culture and put messages out there that cause people to think deeply. I said earlier that we confuse wholesome and biblical. And I think that the church believes that the cultural discussion, the cultural war, is all about morality. But I'm going to say that morality is really downstream. It's a byproduct of something. And it's actually relative. Morality in the 1950s is different than morality is today, because our morality is a reflection of the values of a community of people at a moment in time. And our values come from our core beliefs. And that's what story is amazingly good at, is causing people to have to confront their core beliefs. Like we said earlier, they're simple questions. Is there a God or not? What's the universe that this story takes place in? How do I relate to that universe? How do we relate to one another based on that universe? And how do we struggle together through life that is common to all of us, in a way that we think deeply, because I promise you, everybody in the room and everybody I know acts according to what they believe, not what they say they believe. You know, if I tell you that I don't believe in gravity, I promise you I'm not jumping off the Empire State Building. I will act according to what I believe. And so the only way to make a lasting impact in the global culture is to make a deep impact and a dent in what people actually believe, and their behavior will follow that. Two other real quick points, and I'll start to wrap up. The movie business is not only a good business because it delivers the kind of returns that I talked about year in and year out for the studios, but believe it or not, it's a growing business. People used to think of it as like an alternative investment bucket. And I would say, although I'm not a finance guy, but I would say that after 2008 and all the struggles, and even when you look around the world in the trauma that's in the global economy, when you look at movies and you say they're recession-proof, I would say, they actually perform better in hard times because they're an inexpensive date. You know, there's, in the United States, there's still, it's a pretty mature business, but it's still growing. There's almost 1.3 billion admissions to movie theaters last year. And one of the reasons is because the average ticket price is about $8. There's a lot of room for more growth in that average ticket price, and technology continues to make room for growth. You know, whether it's Netflix or Hulu or now, you know, YouTube wants to have a subscription business. You can't look any week without seeing somebody else that's trying to start a service that's going to consume content. And so it continues to grow here. The 1.3 billion admissions, like, it dwarfs all of the amusement park admissions, all of the major sporting activity admissions. It's like something like probably 3 to 4 times as big as all of that combined. So it is what informs our culture. Overseas, the business is really growing dramatically. China grew at 48% last year in the movie business. Just last week, they had the biggest box office week in the history of movies in China. 1 week, $546 million of box office. It's growing dramatically. They're going to dwarf our market within probably 2 to 3 years. And those Christian movies will never see the light of day in China, where they have a quota system and where they have censorship, unless it falls off an airplane. We have to tell stories in a different way to reach the global audience. The last thing I'll say is, in our business plan, we are focusing on 2 underserved audiences. The first is, you've probably noticed, studios are making these giant tentpole movies all the time, and there's a lot of reasons for that, which we don't have the time for this morning. But what they have done is abandoned the story-driven adult movie for an aging population all around the world. And we're going to focus there. We think there's a big opportunity. And the second thing is this message that has faith as its core, biblical faith at its core. 2 billion Christians around the planet. And we have to evolve and figure out how to better communicate with them, but it's a massive, massive underserved audience. So in closing, I just want to say, first of all, thank you for listening to me this early in the morning. I want to challenge everybody in the room to engage with the global culture, because I think it's an imperative, even if it's just in discussion with your next door neighbor. We have to do it in a commercial way. John Gramling in the back loves this phrase that we use about a double bottom line, that we have to deliver solid commercial results. We also have to deliver solid results in impacting the culture. So please, all of you, find your